Guiding learners from input to output. Lesson 5. So now we have our story. We've told it in class, we've reviewed it in class, and we've written 2 or more versions of the story that students can read. We want to move beyond the story now. We want to move learners from input to output. And the way to do this is with comprehension-based tasks. The first kind of task I want to talk about is standalone tasks. These could be a set of tasks or a single task that learners complete based on input. So they're given some sort of input and have to do something with that input. They can be independent of any story. So that does not necessarily have to be based on the story that you told together or that they read. These tasks in general should move from input to output. A lot of CI storytellers pause when they see the word output because we know that output does not cause acquisition, but is the result of acquisition. That means that somebody who is able to speak or to write in L2 has acquired enough language to speak and write in L2. Before that, they're not able to speak much, they're not able to write much. So the input is the cause of acquisition. Nevertheless, output must play some role in acquisition, albeit small. But I don't think it's clear exactly what that is. With that in mind, I always move from input to output, understanding that this output is not the cause of acquisition in large part, and input is the cause in large part. Think back to the Pareto principle that we talked about in a previous lesson, the 80-20 rule. 80% of the results come from 20% of the action. And I actually believe this to be even higher when it comes to acquisition. It must be something like 99% of the results come from input. Still, output is fun for learners. Output is a way to show learners that they've acquired language, and so I always do this. I always move from input to output in a structured way. Another kind of comprehension-based task is a story-based task, and I always make this a set of tasks. The reason for this is that we've spent enough time making the story, writing versions of the story, that it makes sense to spend a little bit more time to create a set of tasks for learners. These are going to be related to the story, and again, they're going to move from input to output. And these are going to be the focus of this lesson. So we start with our story. We have our story that we've told, and we have the versions of the story that we have written. As an example, here is a brief version of a story that we have written based on a script. This version is available in our lesson if you want to read it in a website version. From this text, we want to extract guiding questions that will help us make the rest of the activities. So we look for some themes, and there's probably lots of themes that could appear in a story, so maybe there's more than one. Pick one of them and make your questions from that. Develop a few questions you want learners to answer. It doesn't make sense to have learners answer a bunch of questions about this story because it might become tedious. So with that in mind, develop just a handful of questions that you want students to be able to answer. These questions are your North Star. As you're making your CI tasks, your comprehension-based tasks, these questions will guide you. You're always trying to build towards students being able to answer these questions. There are a bunch of kinds of activities that you can make to guide learners from input to output. True or false comprehension questions, for example. These could be listening, they could be reading. Multiple choice questions. Logical or illogical questions. Surveys, there's lots of different kinds of surveys we can use. Sentence scrambles. Close sentences with a Z. Paragraph or discourse scrambles. Matching questions. Logical completions. Find the errors. And lastly, change the form. Let's look at these in more detail. True or false questions. This is pretty straightforward. You just look at the text and write some sentences that are either true or false about the text. You might be able to read these to the class, or you might project them on the screen or print them on a piece of paper so that learners can mark them there. Multiple choice questions are also very straightforward, but I like them because you can vary the difficulty simply by changing the number of options or by making silly options available for learners to look at. Logical or illogical. This is very similar to true and false, except you can write true sentences that make sense, but are illogical in the context of the story. For example, you should tell your professor when you are missing a test. That's a logical statement, and learners then mark this as logical. This is also great because sometimes learners will say, no, that's not logical to me. I don't need to tell the professor when I miss a test. So you can have a discussion that's based on this sentence, which is related to themes that are in the story. Anita doesn't want to take her test. She tells her professor an excuse. So we can use this as a reference back to a theme in the story that we told and read. Surveys. Surveys are interesting because they have many different forms they can take, and there are a few main ones that I use. The first is, does it apply to you? And so you could have something like this. I have a psychology class this quarter. I have at least 3 morning classes. I have a long lunch period, etc. Students then read each option and mark if it applies to them or not. Notice that this is non-linguistic output. And this output is enough in many cases for learners to acquire language. So it doesn't necessarily have to be spoken output, although that is the goal as we move along here. I agree or I disagree. Very similar. You have some sentences that learners read and they mark if they agree or they disagree. This is kind of another trick to get learners to see other forms, the I form in this case, but it's also there so that learners get more comprehensible reps without even realizing it. How often do you... Always, often, sometimes, rarely, never. Again, this is a trick to have learners read these sentences and then simply write down how often they do these activities. It gets them thinking about it and mentally processing the language. It also teaches these frequency words. Okay, another kind of input task is a sentence scramble. So here is an example sentence scramble. There is a sentence that learners have to put in the right order to make a logical sentence. Sometimes there's more than one option, and that's nice too, because learners can see that the language will often be very flexible. Close sentences. There's lots of ways to do these, and the way that I prefer is to have, very similar to the sentence scrambles, have a diagonal line here, and students have most of the sentence done for them. They just have to fill in the blank. And in this case, Anita tener 3 clases trimestre. There are a few words that are missing. Anita tiene, that should be changed. And we're missing este trimestre, the word este. So we have most of the sentence there. They're just missing a couple words that can be filled in. This to me seems almost better suited to be an assessment. Although it is okay as a CI task if it's comprehensible. Paragraph scrambles. This one's pretty fun, but it's also pretty challenging. We have a paragraph that has been jumbled up. The sentences are in order, those are not scrambled, but the order of the paragraph, the order of the sentences has been scrambled. So a mixed up paragraph. It has unique sentences. You can draw them right from the text, but that's a mistake because learners can just simply read the text and find where they appear to determine the order. This assesses comprehension, and very well, because it takes a lot of reading and a lot of thought to put these in the proper order. Sometimes there'll be some that are logically tricky to put in the right order. These are difficult for learners, but they're also difficult to create. You'll find some challenge in this. It takes some practice and it takes some skill to write good ones. But once you have some practice under your belt, this becomes easier and is a great tool to assess comprehension, but also to build towards output. Matching questions. This one's pretty straightforward as well. You mix up the order of your answers and you target the vocabulary that was in the story. So Anita is, only one of those options makes the most sense. Anita has, only one of those options makes the most sense. By using matching, you are able to use more complex sentences and learners are able to piece those together. It's more input disguised as an activity. Logical completions. This one's a bit more open-ended. I am a very, and then the learner would fill in a logical completion to that sentence. In my case, I am a very handsome and intelligent man. Find the errors. I like to use this one after an assessment. So let's say that students took an assessment and there were a bunch of errors that were common among learners. Well, we find these errors, and it could be like this. I should have called. Me llamo es Andrés. Você pode conversar com mim. Ich bin ein Berliner. Je suis 21. Obviously, there's some mistakes here. They're common mistakes among learners. Having them correct these doesn't fix the problem. They'll still make these mistakes, but it does point them out to them, and it makes me feel better as an instructor. The last kind of activity we can make is change the form. We want to change the form from, let's say, the third person singular to the first person singular, or from the second person to the third person plural, something like that. As an example, Miguel goes to the store. So the learner sees Miguel goes to the store, and the learner changes that into I go to the store. This is not a very difficult activity for learners, but it does provide more comprehensible reps on a different form that they had not seen previously. Another kind of activity is open-ended questions, and these should be done towards the end as you get closer to those guiding questions that you want learners to be able to answer at the end. So for example, ¿Te gusta la comida mexicana? Do you like Mexican food? Me gusta, no me gusta. Here we have some cues to help learners be able to answer this question. They're not coming up with this answer on their own entirely, but they will output in this task. I have found that these cues are very helpful for learners. They really lean into them, and that's good. It helps build their confidence in this stage. There are some variations we can make for these open-ended questions. Students write the answers. Students ask the questions in pairs. Students ask the questions in groups. So there's lots of different ways we can go about this. And I recommend that you vary this from story to story. Now, I want to close with this. A little goes a long way. You don't have to do every single activity for every single story that you teach. That would be exhausting for you as the instructor, and it would get repetitive for students. Mix it up. Do 2 or 3 activities for the short version of the story, do 2 or 3 activities for the long version of the story, and that should be more than enough to fill your class period with lots of comprehension-based tasks.